Okay, hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this seminar by the supported and sponsored by the Open University Gender Critical Research Network. I'm John Pike, I'm the convener of the network. We are looking forward to a talk today from Professor Mary Leng, who's Professor of Philosophy at the University of York, who's going to be speaking to us about silencing. We've set up the Gender Critical Research Network as a space for thoughtful, respectful, and robust academic debate of sex and gender. Disagreements welcome, of course, but anyone using hostile, degrading, or insulting language won't be allowed to stay in the seminar. The nature of our topic necessitates using sex-based language, such as male and female. Please, however, do be mindful of the sensitive nature of these topics and help us to maintain an open and respectful academic place. Professor Lang is a specialist in philosophy of maths, but also more recently the founder of two York-based conferences that have brought together scholars from a wide range of disciplinary backgrounds, starting with philosophy, to consider questions of sex and gender. And it's a delight to hand over to her to talk to us today about silencing. Mary will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there'll be a Q&A session, of course. Mary.
Thank you very much, John. I'm going to see if I can manage Teams and share my slides. Let's see. Is that working? Can you see okay? Okay, so there's an episode of Doctor Who that I half remember where one of the Doctor's companions gets stuck inside a Dalek. And the terrible thing about being inside a Dalek, one of the terrible things about being inside of a Dalek is it has the effect of scrambling whatever she's trying to say. So from inside the Dalek, she says, "I'm not a Dalek." And it comes out in a menacing Dalek voice, "I am a Dalek." And from inside the Dalek, she says, "Help, help." And as she gets more agitated and worried about being inside the Dalek, it comes out as a threatening, "Exterminate, exterminate." And sometimes being a woman trying to talk about gender critical ideas on the internet, it can feel a little bit like being stuck inside a Dalek, in that you might say, "Oh, you know, I'm a bit concerned about how we collect data on the gender pay gap. We shouldn't collect it on grounds of gender identity. It would be preferable to collect it on grounds of sex." And people look at you as if you've said, "Exterminate, exterminate, exterminate." So this is a talk that's prompted by my thinking about that phenomenon. So I'm trying to make sense of trying to say one thing and being heard as saying something else. So it's become quite commonplace to mock people who talk about being silenced, and to note when they're loudly saying this from the front pages of newspapers or on book tours and so on, they say, "I'm being silenced." The head of Pink News, for example, tweeted about Suzanne Moore, the joke, "Oh, look, I'm being silenced," she shouts from the front page of the major newspaper. And when those observations are made, it's easy to scoff, right? To think, well, nobody can be being silenced if they have a platform. And in fact, it seems like claiming that you're being silenced can be a way of building a platform. So liberals are meant to look at this and laugh and go away thinking it's fine, nobody is being silenced at all. And this, of course, happens in gender critical circles online. Never mind the fact that those who talk about being silenced typically don't say, "I'm being silenced." What they typically say is, "I won't be silenced." So even though people have tried to shut them up, they say, no, they're not going to be silenced. There is talk of silencing, but insofar as gender critical people who talk about silencing talk of cases where silencing is successful, they typically are talking about the silencing of others. Including those people who contact them privately, thanking them for speaking and saying that they feel scared to do the same. So the standard view, presented within gender critical circles at least is no, people like Kathleen Stock, Suzanne Moore, J.K. Rowling are not being silenced. They're successfully avoiding being silenced. Nevertheless, there are voices who are being silenced by seeing the mistreatment of people who do speak out. In this talk, though, I want to claim something a little bit different. I want to claim that actually even those who do speak out, people like Kathleen Stock, Suzanne Moore, J.K. Rowling, when they protest that they won't be silenced, there actually is a sense in which they're being effectively silenced in certain quarters at least. And in particular, I want to argue that the framing of people as TERFs serves to silence the speech of women who are so labelled, at least in context, typically on the left, where the notion of TERF gets uptake. So to present this argument, I want to turn to some 90s classics of feminist philosophy and the presentation of the so-called silencing argument there. So this is Ray Langton, right, in 1993. So if you are powerful, you sometimes have the ability to silence the speech of the powerless. One way might be to stop the powerless from speaking at all, gag them, threaten them, condemn them to solitary confinement. But there is another, less dramatic but equally effective way. You can let them speak, let them say whatever they like to whomever they like, but stop that speech from counting as an action. More precisely, stop it from counting as the action it was intended to be. So this is the kind of silencing that Langton has in mind, that comes from Austin's speech act theory, an application of that. Some speech acts, Langton says, are unspeakable for women in some contexts. Although the appropriate words can be uttered, you can speak the words, those utterances fail to count as the actions they were intended to be. You're not able to say the thing that you're trying to say with them. So the framework that Langton is using here, as I said, comes from Austin and speech act theory. And it's difficult to distinguish between various speech acts we can make when we utter words. So when I utter the word fire, there's three acts, at least three acts I could be doing when I by means of uttering that word. The first is just what's called the locutionary act, the act of uttering the word. But typically when we utter words to do something more than that. And the second kind of act is what gets known as the illocutionary act, warning somebody that there's a fire. So I utter the word fire and people listen, and if they understand, I manage to warn them that there's a fire. Then finally, there are further acts that I might be trying to do as a consequence of people recognizing what I'm telling them. So these are the perlocutionary acts. So I utter the word fire. By doing so, I warn people that there's a fire, and then my hoped for next act from that is to get people to do something about it, to clear out as a result of realizing that there's a fire. And Langton points out that sometimes circumstances are such that we can succeed in making a locutionary act, we can succeed in saying a word, but we fail in our intended illocutionary act, as people don't recognize what it is that we're trying to tell them. So in the example of fire, this is a classic example of this sort. Normally, if someone goes around shouting fire, people recognize that they're being warned that there's a fire and they do something about it. But suppose that the person in question is on stage, is an actor in a particularly raucous farce. They notice a fire at the back of the room and they start shouting fire, fire, but the audience all think that this is part of the play that they're watching. So instead of recognizing that they're being warned that there's a fire, they sit there and laugh and think that this is just another part of the play. In that case, the actor has succeeded in their locutionary act, but they've failed in their illocutionary act. Now, with that framework in mind, Langton and Hornsby, in their 1993 papers on this phenomenon, talk about ways in which we can stop people from making the illocutionary acts that they intended to make, and this is what they call illocutionary silencing. So you're not stopping people from making illocution, you're not stopping people from uttering a sentence, but you can stop people from succeeding in communicating. So Jennifer Hornsby says, look, in order to succeed in an illocutionary act, it requires not just something of the speaker, but something of the listener too. The listener has to be in a situation where they can recognize what you're trying to say. And Hornsby talks about reciprocity in this context. So she says reciprocity is the condition of linguistic communication. It obtains when people are such as to recognise one another's speech as it's meant to be taken, and thus to ensure the success of attempts to perform speech acts. So when reciprocity obtains, there are things that speakers do simply by being heard as doing them. So if I say fire and people recognise what I'm trying to do, I succeed just by virtue of saying fire. I succeed in warning them. The hearer is now a complementary party to speech actions. The speaker's doing what she does with her words is a product of her attempt and the hearer's recognition of it. Now, just as reciprocity may secure communication, so the absence of conditions that ensure reciprocity may prevent communication. To the extent that reciprocity fails you, you have been deprived of illocutionary potential. Now, Hornsby says, I believe we can understand silencing by thinking of the silenced person as someone who is deprived of illocutionary potential. The silenced person does not have it in her power to do with language what she might want to do. There's no one stopping her from saying the words, but something is stopping her from her words from meaning what she wants them to mean, or being understood as the speech act she wants them to be. So with that in mind, Hornsby tells us how it's possible for people to effectively silence people, illocutionary silence people. So silencing in this sense is the process of depriving of illocutionary potential, and we now see how it might work. It may work by affecting people's mindsets and expectations in such a way that reciprocity fails. So they're not in a situation to recognise what someone's saying. Where reciprocity does fail, what someone might attempt to do, she will not be recognised as attempting to do, and thus cannot be understood as having done. And therefore, given the nature of illocution, it requires people to understand what you're trying to do. She simply cannot successfully do. So why was this notion of silencing used in the feminist philosophy of the 1990s? Well, it came up in the context of discussing pornography. And Langton and Hornsby influentially made the case that it's at least conceivable that pornography has the effect of silencing women. And how does it do that? It silences women by creating a context, a speech context, where women are unable successfully to refuse consent to sex. Why is that? In an environment steeped in pornographic framing, women's utterances of the word no are not read as saying no, at least by those influenced by that framing, but instead as playful moves in a flirtation. So insofar as people are influenced by this framing that pornography applies, where women are presented as saying no but meaning yes, as saying no but wanting ultimately the sex to happen. If people are affected by that, when women say no, or when women utter the word no, they are not heard as genuinely meaning that. So this was used influentially in the 90s to argue that pornography has the effect of silencing women. Now, there's some important objections in the literature to this picture of silencing, and in particular the requirement that of what Hornsby calls reciprocity. So this is Caroline West summarising some of the main arguments in the literature about this. And a lot of the concern about this argument arises from thinking that in saying that someone must be understood in order for them not to have been silenced, it looks like we're demanding too much of the audience. We're demanding that the audience listens attentively to what we say, that they have the capacity to grasp what we mean, and that they are going to be not just a listener but a sympathetic interpreter of our words, and that seems too much. So here's a sampling of some of the challenges. So Ronald Dworkin says the argument is premised on the unacceptable proposition that the right to free speech includes a right to circumstances that encourage one to speak, and a right that others grasp and respect what one means to say. It supposes that everyone, the bigot and the creationist as well as the social reformer, has a right to whatever respectful attention on the part of others is necessary to encourage him to speak his mind and to guarantee that he will be correctly understood. seems that reciprocity is requiring that people understand what you say correctly. And that is absurd, Dawkins says. And in a similar vein, Leslie Green takes proponents of the silencing argument to be committed to the claim that freedom of expression requires a receptive audience disposed to hear the speaker just as they intend to be heard. And again, he concludes that that's just too much to ask, and actually illiberal, and not is going to end with all kinds of restrictive freedoms. And, we have to put people in a room and force them to listen to the speech of people that they're not interested in, for example. So bearing in mind these objections, Caroline West says, well, is there a way of understanding the reciprocity requirement that's not going to place too many constraints on audiences? So this is what she comes up with. So if the right to freedom of speech is to protect what liberals agree is valuable about free speech, speakers' freedom to communicate ideas, then the right to freedom of speech seems to involve the right not to be prevented from distributing meaningful words. And since words are being meaningful only in virtue of how they are received in the community, the right not to be prevented from distributing meaningful words will impose at least some constraints on the natures of those who hear the words. But what kind of constraints could these be? Some kind of constraint involving the grasp or understanding of speakers' words seems to be required if speakers' freedom to distribute ideas is to be protected. But one way of expressing this constraint in a way that meets the objections of Green and Dworkin and others, so a way of expressing the constraint without requiring either that speakers must have the ability to speak or that hearers have duties to pay their speech attention, is this. It's that were speakers to speak and were hearers to want to hear the idea the speaker expressed by so speaking, there's no agent whose actions prevent hearers from comprehending that idea. So Caroline West suggests then what free speech requires is what she calls a comprehension requirement, the requirement that no one acts so as to prevent comprehension. So if someone's trying to listen to what you say and trying to understand what you're saying, no one's actions get in the way of that happening. So West says the comprehension requirement embodied in this counterfactual is a minimal one, which should be distinguished from richer ones, which liberals are unlikely to want to accept. The right to free speech is not, for example, the positive right to have one's ideas understood just as one intended. This would mean that a speaker's right to free speech is violated whenever an audience fails to speak their language. On this conception, a physicist, a pure mathematician, even a philosopher would have their right to free speech violated by audiences which fail to learn sufficient physics, mathematics, or philosophy to enable them to follow the speaker's ideas. And that would be ridiculous, of course. But the requirement I have sketch does not have these consequences. The right to free speech does not require that hearers have the capacity to comprehend what speakers say. It requires merely, in the familiar liberal language of negative rights, that comprehension is not prevented by the actions of another agent. So to motivate this requirement on this comprehension requirement on free speech, West presents a couple of thought experiments. So she says, well, consider this situation first of all. To see why this minimal comprehension requirement seems to be needed in order to protect the freedom of something that is meaningfully called speech, consider the following series of cases. First, imagine that there is a dictator who wishes to silence dissent. Now, he might do that by calling on the services of a government censor, but suppose that, preferring to conceal the true extent of his tyranny, he hits on a more ingenious way of ensuring that dissenters' ideas do not receive public distribution. There's a machine, he has, a voice scrambler, which can be implanted in the larynxes of political dissidents secretly and in the dead of night. The machine systematically replaces selected words dissidents utter with other words of a different meaning. The political dissident utters the words, overthrow the dictator, but the voice scrambler does its thing, and the audience hears the words, support the dictator, emanating from the speaker's mouth. Let's suppose that the machine also functions as a write-income-action scrambler that does something similar for speakers' attempts at communicating their dissenting opinions through other expressive media, so that, try as they might, the dissidents have no means of communicating their dissenting ideas to others. Now, in that circumstance, I think we can all quite happily admit that what the dictator is doing is violating the dissidents' right to free speech. They're not able to express the ideas that they want to express. So that looks like a clear-cut case of violation of free speech. But now West says, well, consider this closely related example. Suppose instead that the dictator achieves the same end of preventing the wide distribution of ideas, but in a slightly different way, not by fiddling with the sounds that emerge from the dissidents' mouths, but by tampering with hearers' minds. The dictator secretly implants a false translation manual, a meaning scrambler, into the heads of hearers. The meaning scrambler causes hearers systematically to fail to grasp the meaning of what the dissidents say. It tells hearers that words such as overthrow, uttered by dissidents in the context of phrases such as overthrow the dictator, means support. The result of this tampering is that although dissidents are not prevented from uttering the words overthrow the dictator, and although hearers are not prevented from hearing them, the scrambler nonetheless prevents the dissidents from successfully expressing certain ideas. Now, West wants to suggest this second case is no less of a violation of the free speech of the dissidents than the first case is. So even though the dissident is now able to utter the words overthrow the dictator, their speech is still being violated because they're not able to utter those words in a way that can be meaningfully taken up by anyone who they're trying to express them to. So in both cases, West says there's a violation of the dissident's right to free speech, since in both cases there's a government agent whose actions prevent speakers from communicating their ideas to others. Under these circumstances, to insist that only in the first case does a violation of the right to free speech occur would be to manifest a puzzling fetish for the distribution of particular noises and scribbles. So something like the comprehension requirement does indeed seem to be required if we're to protect speakers' freedom to communicate ideas. No one should prevent your audience, if they want to hear what you're saying, from being able to understand what you're trying to say. So back to the pornography example then. West says, well, to the extent then that the act of pornographers serves to scramble women's speech, creating a speech context in which people who want to hear what women are saying are nevertheless prevented from really understanding their refusals as refusals, pornography silences women in a way that's relevant to their rights to free speech. So that's how West fixes up the silencing argument in the pornography case. Now I'd like to turn to the application of those ideas in the case of gender critical speech. So suppose I wish to express the following views. Maybe I think there's a difference between male and female people and that this difference is politically relevant. And maybe I think that because there is this politically relevant difference, feminists should resist proposals that have the effect of replacing sex with gender identity in all contexts, and should instead preserve, where it matters, our ability to talk about and track facts about sex. So maybe I want to argue that it's wrong, headed of the Government Equalities Office, to recommend, as they do, to employers to collect data for their gender pay gap reporting figures on the basis of self-declared gender identity rather than sex. So suppose I try and say such things. Well, if I do, I'm liable to be labelled a TERF. And what does it mean to be labelled a TERF? Well, what do we say about someone when we call them a TERF? Here's some examples from popular websites explaining the notion. So transadvocate.com says within feminist and trans discourse, the term refers to a very specific type of person who wraps anti-trans bigotry in the language of feminism. They sound like they're being feminist, but really they're expressing anti-trans bigotry. Some TERFs will insist that they support trans rights as long as the fight doesn't overshadow what they consider real feminist initiatives. But scratch that surface and you'll find the core issue underlying every legitimate sounding concern about trans rights, outshining, say, domestic abuse or reproductive justice, is simple animosity towards trans people's very existence. J.K. Rowling, of course, is a prime example of a TERF, allegedly. Rowling's opinions fall into TERFism, although she refuses to accept the label and even says it's a hateful term. Her rejection of this categorization is how she's able to continue on Twitter. Her strong and controversial belief in women being a political and biological class that should be protected is trans exclusionary, despite the fact that she says that she knows, likes and sympathizes with trans people. If we were to adopt TERF, she would more explicitly be transphobic. However, under the guise of concern for women, she's able to continue sharing her harmful TERF opinions. So TERFs are the kind of people who try and say things that sound like they're caring about women. They try and use feminist sounding language and feminist sounding concerns, but what they're doing with that language and concerns is sharing their hatred and animosity and anti-trans bigotry towards trans people. And a key technique that TERFs use allegedly for doing that is the dog whistle. So again, from a number of sites talking about what it is to be a TERF, we have the Cambridge Student Union Guide to TERF Spotting. The language of TERF ideology is ever changing, always with the aim of sounding reasonable. If your approach to spotting and fighting TERFs is purely based on words and optics, then you're vulnerable to being taken on board by a new dog whistle or talking point. So they sound reasonable, but they're using this to bring you on board with their dangerous ideology. Back to Rowling again. An acquaintance of mine, a cis-gay male, recently contacted me about some of Rowling's tweets on biological sex, saying that he couldn't see what was wrong with what she was saying. This is the danger of the dog whistle. By taking an unreasonable position, the eradication of biological sex, and assigning it to the transgender community en masse, Rowling is attempting to associate ordinary trans people with extremist views. And finally, we get the label gender critical feminism, the title, of course, of the new book by Holly Lawford Smith that was denounced in an open letter by people who hadn't read it. One of the points they made in denouncing it was that the very title was a terrible dog whistle. And we have that here too. So this is from Rational Wiki. Gender critical feminism is a euphemistic slang term invented by TERFs to refer to their hateful mindset. In fact, many TERFs falsely claim the term TERF is a misogynistic slur. This is not new or unique behaviour. Many white supremacists will insist that anti-racist is a code word for anti-white, and insist on being called race realist. So they're just like racists. Technically, gender critical means critical of gender ideology, but even then, both terms are still dog whistles. So here's a few examples of things you might hear these TERFs saying that are really just dog whistles for something else. So like the this is from Rational Wiki again, like the lexicon of the alt-right, they're frequent collaborators. The language of TERFs include many seemingly innocuous terms used in a deliberately hateful manner. This is a deliberate strategy, in part, again, inspired by the racist dog whistling, inspired by the It's Okay to Be White and other campaigns by far-right trolls. Always listening to the context, method of usage, and especially intent is therefore important. So you might find TERFs talking about male violence. When they talk about male violence, this is a transphobic dog whistle that's used to include trans women as part of crimes that male criminals committed. You might hear TERFs talking about how it's important to save women's sports. Again, save women's sports is a transphobic dog whistle. You might hear TERFs talking about sex-based rights, another dog whistle. And you might hear TERFs complaining that sex is real, a straw man of transgender opposition. If you see someone using sex is real as a talking point, they're almost certainly a TERF. Okay, so that's what gets said about TERFs. So what does it mean for your speech if you're labelled a TERF? Well, I want to suggest that the effect is, at least to audiences who are familiar with this framing, the effect is that your speech becomes scrambled. So what the framing of someone as a TERF does is to warn the audience that the person who's being labelled a TERF will use words and phrases that look on the surface to be expressing standard feminist concerns, but aren't really doing that. They're really just dog whistles being used to express hatred of trans women. And if we're in that speech context, if we're in a situation where people are primed to see the TERF as using a dog whistle, then someone who uses words that would conventionally be used to express, for example, their concern about gender pay gap statistics won't be read as expressing that concern. Instead, they might be heard as having uttered as this is Laurie Penny's words about J.K. Rowling, as having uttered a public spasm, part of a larger, weirder pattern of prejudice. So am I right in thinking that we have the same kind of phenomena going on as Caroline West identifies in the case of the silencing argument for pornography? Does this scrambling meet the West test? So remember, for Caroline West, the right to free speech requires that comprehension is not prevented by the actions of another agent. And we might worry here that there's no single agent here. There's no one person who's in the role of dictator who's scrambling gender critical speech. But bear in mind, the same is true in the case of pornography, right? There's no single pornographer whose pornographic output scramble consent. It's rather that there's a bunch of people who are putting out output that has the effect of changing the general air around women's use of the word no. It's also the case that the scrambling effect isn't universal. Not everybody is prevented from hearing gender critical speech as it is intended. Not everybody is influenced by turf framing. But again, the same is the case in the pornography example. So in pornography scrambling effects needn't be universal. Some people are going to be more susceptible to it than others. And actually, Caroline West argues scrambling can cause a problem for free speech, even if it's very limited. So she says, even if one person's voice gets scrambled, their speech has been violated, even if others are free to say the same thing. And similarly, then, only if one would-be hearer were rendered incapable of comprehending speakers' token expressions of ideas of a certain type by the actions of an agent, that would count as a violation of speakers' rights to communicate those ideas, no matter how many other hearers are in a position to comprehend that idea perfectly well. So even though scrambling isn't universal and it's not the act of one individual, nevertheless, turf scrambling seems to have a similar scope to the pornographic key example that the silencing argument started with. So another concern we might have is about the power dynamics involved in silencing, because we might think we need power to silence. When Langton introduces the way that silencing can happen, illocutionary silencing can happen, she says, if you're powerful, you sometimes have the ability to silence the speech of the powerless. And it might seem ridiculous to think that trans people, who are clearly the oppressed minority, are able to silence billionaire J.K. Rowling. After all, they're oppressed without power, and she's extremely powerful in this world. So in relation to that, we need to think about the context and the way power dynamics differ in different contexts. So as mentioned already, silencing isn't equal everywhere, it's relative to context. And there are contexts, I think, where people who purport to speak on behalf of trans people, by the way, who often aren't themselves trans, and who perpetuate this turf framing, are highly influential. So in the sources I quoted above, the various websites, the people presenting these ideas have some influence to their audience given the context they're in. So one of the examples was the Cambridge University Student Union Guide to How to Spot Turf Ideology. Now, if you're a student newly arrived at Cambridge and your student union presents you with this, there's a sense in which you're primed to listen to them. They have the power to influence the way you think about these issues, just because of the power dynamics within that microcosm. So even if some of these silencers who use the turf framing are not universally powerful, they're powerful in certain domains, and that's where the silencing works. And as we've already said, silencing doesn't have to be universal. It can be context specific, it can apply to some groups rather than others. So the limited claim here is that there are power dynamics where people can silence the speech of gender critical speakers. So where does all that leave us? So what I've argued for is that silencing works in the case of gender critical speech on the same kind of model as Langton and Hornsby say silencing works in the case of pornography. So there are contexts where people are not heard, not able to be heard as saying the things that they're trying to say because of the way that certain framing of their speech changes the meaning that people will pick up from them. And in the original silencing argument, this is of course used to make a case for censorship, a liberal case for censorship on free speech grounds. So the pornography argument originally was, well, pornography can't be stopped because it counts as speech and free speech really matters. And the response to that was, well, if free speech matters, then what about the speech of women? We've at least got a rights conflict there because we have women speaking and pornographers speaking, and the pornographer's speech silences the speech of the women. So we should at least consider whether there's a free speech grounds for silencing the pornographers in what they're doing. Now, that's quite a hard case to argue, and I think it's an even harder case to argue against people who use TERF framing. So on free speech grounds, to say that the speech of people who call people TERFs and use that kind of framing should be curtailed in order to protect the speech of gender critical people, I think that would be a hard case to make, and it's certainly not a case I would like to make. But interestingly, in the pornography case, it's worth bearing in mind that we didn't manage to silence pornographers. Pornography still exists, and yet it seems we have managed to somehow make progress on the issue of women being heard and women's consent or failure to consent being properly heard. So the way that was made out, the way that change happened, in part was recognizing that people weren't hearing women and weren't hearing no as meaning no because of this context in which no is meant as a playful game and so on. And so in recognition of that, women then started the No Means No campaign and started more carefully spelling out, no, this really does mean no, so that eventually the message got through despite all of that silencing or potentially silencing context. So perhaps we can learn a little bit from that, you know, there was able to be some breakthrough in hearing the speech of women and hearing their consent or failure to consent properly through methods that didn't just involve quietening down the silencing voices. So on the model of that, perhaps the best we can do, or gender critical women can do if they want to be heard, is not to try and stop people calling themselves TERFs and so on, but to continue to speak and to continue to try and emphasize that they're not endorsing the negative implicatures that are associated by TERF framing with their views, in the hope that eventually they'll be heard as really meaning what they try to say. Until that time, though, we're in the unfortunate position of another 90s classic. If you're influenced by TERF framing, then, well, I will talk, maybe you will listen, but you won't hear a single word that I say. Thank you.